and with whom we've had project partnerships over the last number of years, and those project partnerships involve us as IDASA in a number of countries in sub-Saharan Africa. But because of recent developments in South Africa itself and the implications that those might have for the region, broadly defined, we mentioned to some friends of ours that if there were some folks who were interested in listening to us talk, we wouldn't mind talking. So this audience is a little bit daunting to me, and I hope we can live up to it. Judith and I are going to talk a little bit about what we know, and then we're going to make sure there's space for questions during which you can discover what we don't know. I'm going to just mention a few contextual issues, and then Judith February is going to talk about some of the texture and detail of the very significant leadership change which is occurring in South Africa within the governing party, and then because that is an appropriate segue into what one might expect in terms of South African policy in the region, she might hand back to me for a minute or so before we enter questions, Lyman. I understand that South Africa made the front pages of the New York Times today. I haven't seen it myself, but as countries don't normally make the front pages of the New York Times, and as this is an important time for America politically, which makes it even more interesting that we've made the front page of the New York Times, I thought I should start there. We made the front page of the New York Times because there is an electricity crisis in South Africa. It wouldn't matter so much if I and my colleagues were disadvantaged in terms of our ability to read after hours and get hot water in the morning. But this particular electricity crisis has shut down the gold mines in South Africa. And last week they were non-operational. They, as you can imagine, that did send the price of gold and platinum up as it became clear that demand was going to shorten, and it put some pressure on some very big companies in South Africa, and indeed, as you know, the gold mines and perhaps the platinum mines to a lesser extent are flagship industries for South Africa. We always used to boast that we were the main producer of gold in the world, or well, we were until a few months ago when China overtook us. But nevertheless, these are primary production for us. Now, a few days ago, two cabinet ministers held a press conference in South Africa, at which they apologized for the fact that we were running out of power. That, of course, is a very significant action by a government, and I think it's indicative of a very high level of responsiveness by the South African government to this energy crisis. Of course, they didn't resign, but they did promise to fix things. And every indication is that they will use the strategy which South Africans normally use to try and fix things, which is to get everybody involved. Citizens, the business community, various sections of the state. And it seems that the main plan is going to be to persuade citizens that a little bit of personal suffering in order to enable power to go to the mines, amongst other industries, is in order. But where did this crisis come from? Because it's indicative of the challenges facing South Africa. The first is that 10 years ago, the assumption was that in order to get the economy going in South Africa, there would have to be a significant amount of deregulation and private sector involvement. And so the energy sector was identified as one of those areas where the private sector could and should make a contribution. And the state utilities were dissuaded from expanding their network and building new power stations in order to leave open a market opportunity for the private sector. We were not completely wholehearted in this approach. We were trying, as many countries do, to hedge our bets. So the state retained the monopoly on the purchase of electricity and the wholesaling of that and the retailing of that down to its citizens. So the private sector could come in, it could sell electricity to the national grid via a government-owned company, and then it would eventually get down to the citizen. Well, the price of electricity was so low, and the opportunities globally were so great, and the demands globally were so great, that in fact the private sector didn't take up the opportunity in South Africa. It took us a couple of years to notice, and then a bit of time to rejig things. And of course, that means we've been caught short on energy production. But in addition to that, during the same period, we decided that we had enough energy to get by, and so we mothballed a couple of rather large power stations. And in the process of mothballing those, we also released from that sector a whole lot of engineers. It was part of our transformation process of bringing in previously disadvantaged people. A whole lot of previously white engineers left the industry. And so in addition to the problem of energy supply, we have the problem of human resource supply to get back on track. And then we have a third dilemma. The third dilemma is that the economy has been growing since 1994, year on year, and South Africa has been building houses to the point now where something over half the population own their private houses. The majority of those are electrified, and a rising affluent middle class, together with an extremely wealthy white community which was benefiting from the rewards of rejoining the global economy, has made demands on electricity supply out of all proportion to those initial estimates taken way back in 97, 98. So policy dilemmas, partly brought on by a global sense of what was the appropriate type of policy to have, hedging bets on policy, not wanting to go too far one way or the other, which is perfectly understandable, human resource dilemmas, and the dilemmas of growth, together with unseasonal rains in South Africa, basically collapsed our energy production a couple of weeks ago. It'll get back on track, and within a couple of weeks, it seems like the mines will be moving at about 90% of previous capacity. And to put a silver lining on this, we're going to become a much more energy efficient country very rapidly, something we probably should have done years ago. I tell this anecdote, not so that you'll have sympathy for South Africans without power, although those from the West Coast at least might have, but because it so perfectly encapsulates the dilemmas of a country like South Africa, trying to keep ahead of the curve and try to keep its economy going, try to expand that economy from serving 4.5 million people to serving close on 50 million people, trying to transform both the private and public sector so that previously disadvantaged people, black people, enter that economy both as owners and as managers and as workers. And trying to do that all with tremendous constraints on education, on health, and on other sectors which would normally drive human resource development. Now, there's been a crisis in energy, but that crisis overshadows similar dilemmas and crises in other parts of the economy. The delivery of municipal services to the poor, the rolling out of clean water to poor people, the rolling out of housing. And as a result of these dilemmas, many people in South Africa have felt seriously left behind and shut out from what one might call a democracy dividend. They have increasingly felt that the government was trying to ensure that we competed globally and reputationally in certain ways, and that the next generation would do better than this generation, but this generation was feeling somewhat shut out. And so in the last couple of years, there have been significant community protests around the country in South Africa, stimulated by a whole range of issues, numbering in the many thousands, where conflict between the government and citizens has occasionally led to short-term destabilization of those municipalities, certain levels of violence, and so on. The second dilemma that is facing the country at the moment is that despite all this, South Africa retains a tremendous magnet for folk seeking to earn a living, and therefore immigration into South Africa is very substantial and remains substantial. And that puts its own strains on particularly the urban areas, but it is increasingly putting strains on the politics of South Africa. These various dilemmas came to a head last year in what was seen as a conflict between two individuals who represented different points of view on how the governing party should move forward. President Mbeki, who is state president, and Deputy President Zuma, who was deputy president of the governing party. And the personification of that conflict was what probably reached the headlines in other parts of the world. And it was that conflict which led to a very important congress of the ruling party last year in Polokwane, which Judith is going to talk about. Let me make one last point about our system of government. South Africa has a sort of semi-presidential system of government, a proportional representation system, the result of which is that the African National Congress holds about 70% of the seats in the parliament, and that party therefore governs, and the electoral college, which is elected at our national elections, chooses the president of the country. It's not a direct election. It's an indirect election. As a quirk of history, the national electoral cycle in South Africa is 2 years off cycle with the electoral cycle of the African National Congress, the governing party in South Africa. And therefore, in 2007, the governing party held its own elections, and that election Judith is going to talk about. But you need to understand that there is this odd cycle of, let's call it, party elections separate from national elections. It is not a parliamentary system. In other words, the leader of the party does not automatically become the head of government, nor is it an entirely presidential election in which the president of the country is directly elected. It falls between these two stools, and that creates, as you'll hear, a number of dilemmas. And at that point, let me pause and hand back to Lyman.
Thank you very much, Paul. And now to follow up, as you say, on what happened at the party congress at Polokwane, Judith February. Judith February is also at IDASA. She's a leader of the Political Information and Monitoring Service. She is a lawyer. She was the civil society representative on the National Anti-Corruption Forum in 2005. She's involved in the Civil Society Network Against Corruption, and she currently serves on an ad hoc panel to evaluate the effectiveness of South Africa's parliament. She's a regular contributor to, and I won't try to pronounce it, but IDASA's online political journal, and is a regular commentator in the media on politics in South Africa. Judith, thank you, and over to you.
Thanks very much, Princeton. Can everyone hear me all right? As Paul said, it really is good for us to be here, and I think that I will sketch a little bit of background on the ANC conference at Polokwane, but hopefully what I say will stimulate some debate, and that there might be a richer discussion during question time. It was the conference itself was very interesting, I think, from a number of viewpoints. I think the first issue one wants to raise, there are two or three actually. The first one is this question of leadership. I think that it's no over-exaggeration to say that at the moment South Africa faces a moment where we are redefining our political spaces, and some of that I think is threatening, and part of it is also a result of a very real organic democratic process amongst people, members of the ANC, and citizens at large, on trying to create voice and trying to get their foot in to what has recently been, I think we must be frank, in the Mbeki years, what people have felt is a shutting down of the political space. And to take us back, I want to just deliberate a little bit on the South African Constitution. Paul talked about our system of government, but really I think to understand what's happening in Polokwane, to understand the spaces within which we operate at the moment, I think it's important to understand the Constitution and this sort of very aspirational document which South Africans drew up, and which was a result, I think, first and foremost, of a very participatory process. And I think sometimes we underestimate the fact that there were thousands and thousands of submissions made on the Constitution, on various aspects of it, whether it was on the electoral system, on socioeconomic rights, on various aspects of the Constitution. And the people were deeply involved. This was a democracy in which people were very involved in fashioning it. The Constitution provides the two threads that run through our Constitution. First one is obviously the question of representative democracy, and that's the sort of very basic formal aspects of democracy around the vote and so on. But secondly, this idea of participatory democracy. And this in our Constitution has various faces, various aspects to it. The first one, I think, is clearly, and this notion of participation, particularly in the South African Parliament, where citizens are able to make submissions on pieces of legislation, also in local governance, the way in which local government has been set up, that the citizens are definitely, in terms of the law, supposed to be at the centre and at the heart of these processes. And there are various aspects of the Constitution around consultation and so on that one can go through. And this is very important because this document, which we have defined as our framework, is supposed to put people at its heart. But there's a difference, obviously, in most democracies, I think, between what our aspirations are and what we achieve in reality. Just another point about the South African Constitution is, and this is important, is that we, in Chapter 2, which is our Bill of Rights, we've also enshrined socioeconomic rights. So the right to healthcare, the right to housing, the right to a clean environment, and the right to education. And these are basic rights, and it means that in legal terms, these rights are what we call justiciable. So people can actually sue on these rights. And that was a very far-reaching goal of the Constitution, is to provide these socioeconomic rights and to produce have a society which is one which is really a more equitable and more just society. Again, of course, as I said before, the gap between our aspirations and what we have on paper and the reality of very different things. So you've tended to have a lot of the participation within the Constitution and what the Constitution requires has often been quite formalistic. And the way in which Parliament, for example, and I sort of work a lot with the South African Parliament, the way in which Parliament's fashioned public participation, that horrible phrase, has been very formalistic. It's been quite technocratic. And so also at local government level, where people are supposed to be involved in the processes, we found that people really find themselves outside of really where things happen, outside of the circle of power, in a sense. Add to that, I think, the great dilemmas in South Africa around race and class, where in crude terms you're more likely to be black and poor than white and poor. You have a recipe for exclusion. And so our society, when Paul's talked about these ongoing municipal protests, is that really the theme in our society has been one of inclusion and exclusion. And the majority of people still remain excluded from the gains of post-apartheid South Africa. Enter into this, and this is where one comes to leadership, enter into this scenario the leadership of President Mbeki and his cabinet since 1999, and we're dealing with a very different animal to the Mandela presidency. And so you had a rise in technocratic government, and I think that, when we have to strike a balance. I certainly would argue that a bit of technocracy is not a bad thing, and that you do want a state which is efficient and effective, and also which has research capacity and the capacity to engage with different ideas. But I think what we found in the Mbeki years was a sort of a type of leadership which really was, one could say, undermining those elements of participatory democracy, and really that's citizen voice coming forward. And a great deal of even greater exclusion, I would argue, of people and their lived experiences, and people feeling part of being able to trying to find solutions. And I suppose people in this room are familiar with the argument, these debates in South Africa around, for example, HIV and AIDS. What a very polarizing debate that was when the president entered into it, and in a sense took upon himself the monopoly on wisdom and how to deal with this problem. And I think that the issue of AIDS is also really an example of the kind of leadership often that's presented itself during these years and which has excluded people. And I raise it because I think that it's provided a backdrop to Polokwane. As I said, I was at Polokwane, and it was a very complex, I think, 5 days of politics. what you had, just to go back, is in 1996, the South African government adopted an economic policy, GEAR, focusing on growth and redistribution. Highly unpopular, particularly amongst the ANC's alliance partners. The ANC governs in an alliance of itself, the Congress of South African Trade Unions and the South African Communist Party. And I know we talk to quite a lot of foreign visitors, and they go, how is that possible to have the workers, communists, and then the ANC? But somehow it's worked for us. There was a lot of, obviously, pressure from within COSATU and the SACP particularly to shift some of those economic policies, but also to simply have people included in the way in which some decisions were made around the economy. And I think the unions particularly, their concerns were, we were not consulted. You adopted a macroeconomic policy and we were not consulted. And really they needed a peg to hang this, to hang all their complaints onto. And enter the person of Jacob Zuma, who is himself, I think if one talks about leadership, quite an interesting individual, I think. Although I think it's important, and I'll talk about this a bit later if time allows, but that we move beyond a particular individual. The reason why I mentioned the Constitution was because I think the Constitution provides us the space 14 years on, while individuals, and we've always argued this, individuals in leadership is important, but I think the Constitution provides us with a space in which we can start thinking of countervailing forces of power to the executive and how to strengthen the institutions that we have so that in fact it becomes less and less important who the one individual is at the top, and that you're actually trying to create a democracy of the people and you're trying to strengthen institutions. Hence, for example, our work on Parliament, and I see Joel Barkin here, and he might have some things to say about the South African Parliament. And hence we need to keep engaging around our institutions and to make them robust. We've seen that often during the Mbeki years they've been rather deferential to the executive. Has Parliament taken its rightful place? Has it exercised proper oversight over the executive? What are our views on ethics, on issues of corruption and so on? Also, our courts. We've seen a very robust judiciary, particularly on issues of the Constitution, on implementing socioeconomic rights, the media, civil society. So I think it's important that whatever happened at Polokwane and whatever our concerns about an individual, that the South African democracy is about the different parts that we've created. And I think particularly why I say we're at a moment of redefining the political space and redefining in a way what our common values are and finding those. It is about strengthening these institutions and having the right leadership in particular institutions to actually make them work. And so flip back to Polokwane. So you had a number of people within the ANC over the past, since I would argue about 2000, well, even before 2005, but it really came to a head in 2005 when the ANC had its policy conference, National General Council meeting in 2005 in Johannesburg, and there was a visceral response to President Mbeki and his leadership, and people really, a desire by people within the ANC and also within the alliance partners to really have their voices heard and to not simply accept, whether it was on issues of housing, the public service, on issues of corruption, on ethics, various resolutions that were taken at that conference, which were quite far-reaching in terms of trying to fashion a different type of ANC, one which is more responsive to individuals. It was quite clear that even at that time in 2005 that President Mbeki was thought that he could ride the storm. And until the policy conference the next June, in which the ANC had, and again, real challenges to his leadership. And during this time, of course, you had the Deputy President, Jacob Zuma, who, without going into too much detail about the details of the case, who was fired by Mbeki for charges of corruption, a corrupt relationship with his financial advisor, and also certain possible corrupt practices in relation to South Africa's multi-billion rand arms deal, which represented the biggest post-apartheid expenditure we've had. And this, needless to say, created a great deal of schism within the ruling party, whether President Mbeki should have done that, should he have fired Jacob Zuma, was that the right thing to do, and so on. And it became clear that people were pushing his candidacy for the presidency of the ANC. And despite the fact that there was a lot of surprise, I think, at Polokwane amongst those closest to President Mbeki, I think that most people who were there from day one would have seen it coming, or even seen it coming since 2005, given the fact that there was so much disgruntlement amongst ordinary people around feeling that they're not being heard and not being listened to. And so when one talks about leadership, I think the leadership challenge, and we've seen the ANC doing this since Polokwane, since the conference, is trying to shore up support within its branches. The ANC operates on a system of branches. What we know is that 51% of those branches were dysfunctional. There was just not the connection between the branch and the party like there used to be. And what the ANC has been doing is going around to these branches and trying to, again, rebuild the party so that it does really reflect the voices of ordinary people. And I think that's important. So while I think that there are certain very serious questions we need to ask ourselves as South Africans, I think, about a possible Zuma presidency. And as Paul said, he is the president of the ANC, of the ruling party. It does not necessarily mean a natural ascent to the presidency. There's much that can happen. He's been charged with corruption. His trial is due to start in August. So it will once again place a great deal of pressure, of course, when we talk about the independence of our institutions. We talk about the courts and how they will stand up to that challenge of trying a very powerful individual. It's happened before. While we have to, I think, focus on the individual and also the shortcomings here, I think that there are a lot of opportunities for us as a democracy, also a lot of lessons that we can learn out of the Mbeki presidency. And I think for someone like Jacob Zuma and the new ANC leadership, of the dangers of excluding citizens, of the dangers of disconnecting from the rank and file of the party. And what was most interesting at Polokwane is, it was, in many senses, quite a revolution from the floor, that individual people were really taking the party back from also what was a culture of accumulation, which has been quite considerable amongst the leadership of the party. And one of the members of the ANC turned around and said, "We did this because we don't want to be like Zimbabwe." And I thought that was an interesting comment. And they said, we don't want a leader of a party who's going to be there forever and rule from behind. Of course, that places a greater responsibility, I think, then for individuals to choose the next leadership in a way which reflects the values of the Constitution and which is principled leadership and not opportunistic leadership. And so it provides us with another opportunity, as I said, to redefine our political spaces, to start rethinking these principles of transparency, of accountability, and openness and responsiveness. And what does it really mean to have a participatory democracy with citizens at its heart? And for whatever is Jacob Zuma's weaknesses, I think there are certain very interesting individuals within the top 6 of the ANC who certainly are independent-minded. And I think the interesting part of this is that it's grouped together such a very different group, number of people who are some ideologically different, some people who have very different backgrounds and very different ways in which they came to the ANC. And so, for example, you've got the chairperson of the party is also the Speaker of Parliament, and there's certain issues around that. But you have the Treasurer General of the ANC, for example, who's been very outspoken on issues like how can one regulate political party financing, for example, which is something we would welcome. And so the question is, how do organizations like IDASA at these quite crucial times try to influence and find those spaces? You've got Thandi Modise, who's also within the top 6 of the ANC, And she was very interesting, very outspoken on the arms deal, a very independent-minded parliamentarian. And so it is good, in a sense, to see some of these people coming back into leadership positions within the party. And so I think the challenge for us will be, firstly, is how can we undergird our institutions? How do we, as citizens, as civil society organizations, again, take up the responsibility, I think, which is very real? Because in a sense, we were very good at setting up the trappings of democracy. We're very good at setting up these institutions, but who you populate them with and how you're able to insulate them from political pressure is going to be crucial, I think, in the days ahead. And so, I think we have deep responsibility in that regard. But also to look at the opportunities that we have in the political landscape at the moment to really be influencing that debate. I think the last point I want to make is also around issues of policy. I think that there's been a lot of nervousness amongst a range of people on policy. If there's a Zuma presidency, what's going to happen? Is policy going to change? Is the ANC, what will happen to the Minister of Finance, Trevor Manuel? Even in this 18-month period, people are very concerned that the ANC, because what we're seeing at the moment is really quite interesting, if you like, that sort of thing, sparring match between the ANC and government and the party. It's actually quite an interesting mechanism of accountability. I mean, people were saying, given the state of our opposition politics, that this is about as near to opposition as we're going to get. And so in a lot of that sort of sparring, there is also the ANC, I think, as a party, often punching above its weight, in a sense, demanding more from those in the union buildings than is possible. And there's nothing wrong with that intrinsically, and I think we're seeing more apologies on the electricity matter and other matters than we've ever seen come out of the union buildings. So because power rests slightly more uneasily. And for those of us, I think, who've been arguing for a little bit of uncertainty in the political system, we certainly have it at the moment. So, but on questions of policy, I mean, I think the ANC has been quite cautious thus far. Also cautious, I think, to be saying the right things around particularly issues of finance. We've had a very good track record of managing our economy, year-on-year growth, and also doing so in a way which is accountable and transparent. And so I don't see the ANC there being wholesale changes, or indeed not changes that we couldn't have envisaged in the first place. I think there will be a greater challenge coming from the party on things like questions of inflation targeting, for example. There's a debate going on about that in South Africa, questions of industrial policy. And these issues should be debated. But whether, that means that a possible Zuma presidency might sort of dismantle the architecture, I think that's probably a naive assessment. I think that the ANC as a collective is probably smarter than that and realizes the very definite dangers of killing off the goose that lays the golden egg. And so hence the electricity crisis, to just end with that, I think is an interesting example of the way in probably perhaps a new kind of politics, and we hope for that, a new kind of politics which brings people on board. And certainly in Polokwane we saw very definite shifts. Having said that, obviously the new leadership is not entirely saint-like, and so the question will be how we hold those leaders to account and how we demand from from those in power and those within the ruling party the greater transparency and greater accountability. And I think if we say that's going to be easy, it would also be naive. So I think I'll end there. Before I get kicked out.
Just very briefly on international policy. I think the first thing to say is that until around about April, May next year, the incumbent government remains in the union buildings, and therefore foreign policy remains in the hands of those who are presently exercising that power. And so there will be policy consistency. But I think people who've been watching closely may already have noticed Mr. Zuma in Davos adopting a slightly more explicit and critical approach on issues of human rights and democracy. Comments on Kenya, for example, and on Nigeria. And I think that the international leadership within the ANC does have some commitment to returning to what was originally the view of South African foreign policy, which is that it would in fact be a human rights-based policy rather than purely an interest-based policy. But of course that same group of people is also responsive to South African citizen voice, and one should not think that South African citizen voice is universally tolerant and accepting of the way we handle, for example, the disbursement of troops in peacekeeping operations, or our relations with neighboring countries and our open immigration policies, or our dealing with refugees and so on. So there's going to be a real challenge to groups working in South Africa to ensure that an ANC which is now more responsive to its grassroots will find that grassroots is actually more responsive to human rights and democracy issues in the region. And that, I think, is going to be an interesting challenge. And that will impact on our contributions to the African Union, our ongoing commitment to SADC, the view that we take on the future of Zimbabwe post-election, and so on. And I think that probably is the point we should stop. Thank you.
Thank you both. Let me just have one question and then open it up. Judith, your assessment is kind of upbeat, and I'm glad to hear it. But there seems to be a disconnect between two things. Jacob Zuma, for a lot of reasons, complicated reasons, has become the leader and symbol for all the opposition that you talked about. But when you talk about accountability, here is an individual who is on the verge of being charged with corruption. And the question is, if he's convicted, will his supporters say, good, this is accountability, this is what we really want in the party, or will it turn into something else? I mean, after all, rallying around someone who is already suspected, maybe he's not guilty, but suspected for a lot of reasons of being corrupt, doesn't encourage one to think that this new leadership, grassroots, if it is grassroots, leadership is really going to lead to better accountability.
Would you like me to answer?
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. I suppose I'm upbeat depending on which day you get me, for instance. The question is, I think, around the grassroots. I mean, I think you're absolutely right. How deep is that grassroots support? The point is, I think they're separate issues. I mean, the ANC has already said that if Jacob Zuma is convicted, it will have to obviously take action, and hence the debate that we're having in South Africa at the moment, which is around looking at the ANC Deputy President, Kgalema Motlanthe, for example. I mean, some newspapers are already billing him, and certainly, I spent all that time at Polokwane, and certainly if there was one individual in the room, even more so than Jacob Zuma, who was able to have the respect of everyone on the conference floor, it was him. And certainly he's been, I think, quite strategic in the way in which he's placed himself. So I think that this idea of a kind of plain sailing as ascent to power, I think that's over-exaggerated. The other point about that is also that the supporters of Jacob Zuma are not an homogenous group of people. I think that's a very important point to make, is that there are a lot of people who are supporting him for very different reasons. One being he's not Mbeki. There are a lot of people who, and that sounds amusing, but it's true. There are a lot of people who we know extremely well who wanted that time for change. They wanted that moment where things could change, and they're sort of going, well, there is Zuma, but some of them are hoping that the corruption charges will stick and we'll be talking about somebody else. And it's certainly an opinion that's out there. So I think that to view all his supporters as sort of one group of people who's an homogenous group, I think that is a mistake. Also, which is important in terms of if he is guilty, how one would deal with the supporters and so on. I think that generally one would like to believe that there is a level of tolerance for the rule of law, and I think certainly we've seen that recently. Particularly, we've been having very complex debates in South Africa about the independence of the judiciary and our courts, and there was I won't go into the details, but quite an uncomfortable incident around a constitutional court judge. The ANC new Secretary General, Gwedi Mantashe, made some rather unwise comments about judges and so on. And of course, it had everyone feeling really nervous. And the next day, immediately, the ANC dispatched Kgalema Motlanthe, interestingly enough, to go and speak to the Chief Justice and the judge concerned to clarify things. So I think that the ANC is very aware, clearly aware of the role of the courts, and also what sort of signs the questions around the independence of the judiciary would send. So I don't think that I'm more sort of positive about that, about people also accepting the outcome, because I do think that there would be people like Kgalema Motlanthe who would step into that breach, and already people are earmarking him. So and who would be able to say to people, you need to accept the verdict. So I'm less concerned about that. Paul, I don't know if you want to add to that.
Let me open up. When you ask a question, please identify yourself and your affiliation. I think I'll take 2 or 3 questions at a time. Someone way in the back there. Yes, gentlemen. Wait for a microphone. There he is. Oh, it's Dan. Okay.
Yeah, I'm Dan O'Flaherty with the U.S. South Africa Business Council at the Corporate Council on Africa. Mr. Graham, you discussed the power shortages as likely to abate in about 90 days, but in yesterday's business day, the senior vice president of ESCOM was quoted as saying they would discourage new major industrial projects until 2012, which is a very serious matter. Would you agree with that?
Let's take a couple more, and then we'll come. Yes. Got a microphone for...
My name is Shola Omoli. I'm with Chevron. One of the points that Judith made was the fact that this subject ought to be seen beyond an individual, and we ought to be looking at constitutional frameworks. My question is, how do we begin in this region, in Africa as a whole, to deal with what I describe as the imperial president, the zero-sum game? I mean, if you look across the continent, even Museveni has been there how many years? Zimbabwe. Look at what's going on in Kenya. Nigeria was saved from Obasanjo's third-term project. How do we deal with this issue of the imperial president, the fellow who knows it all? How do we give voice to the people so that these leaders stop taking us for a ride?
Thank you. So I'll take one more. Marina? Oh, and I'll come back to you. I'm sorry.
Marina Ottaway, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. In a sense, my question follows up both on the point that Princeton made and on the last question, because, Judith, you have described a situation in which there is now this kind of adversarial relation to some extent between what you have described, the grassroots of the party trying to reassert a voice vis-à-vis the president. But are the conditions there for this to last past this period of a few months, essentially, where you have Mbeki on one side and Zuma on the other?
Let's take those 3 answers, and then I'll come back to taking the Paul, you want to start with the question on infrastructure power?
Yes, I think there's going to be a short-term fix which will just cope with the existing demand. The combination of a variety of things, including rationing. So it's certainly not going to deal with major new demands on power generation, and we seem to be working pretty much at full capacity at the moment. So the energy reserve is very small, which has an impact on, for example, maintenance schedules. You have to keep things running in order to just deal with the energy demand. You can't deal with the downtime. I do think that there's a discussion going on between Eskom and the government about whether their rather bleak outlook is entirely correct, and I suspect that they're going to keep giving the bleak outlook as part of their public discussion on this thing, because obviously they would like to get a lot more money out of government in order to speed up the new developments. So I think it may be a few months before we can really tell. The government believes that getting new big projects like the aluminium smelters and so on stream is a relatively slow process, and I think they're hoping that they're far enough down the track that they might get through this initial dilemma. We're not going to make our growth targets, and we are going to constrain investments, I think. And certain optimisms, like the coming on stream of the Congo hydroelectric power, is certainly not going to happen for some time to come. So for the private sector, this is pretty bad news, and I don't think anyone can gloss over that. Unfortunately, the problem with imperial presidencies is that the fellow in charge does know it all.
Yes.
You know, because presidencies accrete power and knowledge and their patronage and even give their citizens a sense of security and a sense that, look, at least the fellow we know and over time they do come to believe that therefore they are the best bet for societies. It's one of the reasons that we must try and avoid at all costs retreating on term limits in Africa, and we mustn't allow the discourse to re-emerge that, look, after all, the United Kingdom doesn't have term limits. Well, that may be true, and more shame to them. But because term limits force the presidents to consider succession, and they establish a habit among citizens of accepting change, and therefore we have to just stick to it, even if the guy is the best guy for the job. Let's find someone else and get on with life, and that is going to happen in South Africa. President Mbeki, even if he had become president of the ANC, would not have stood for a third term as president of the country. That is clear. But now there's not even a hint of a doubt about it.
Judith, picking up on that and the two questions, Shola's question and Marina's, when you deal with that, this question of Parliament or other institutions, you talked about the judiciary, but the Parliament really hasn't been a check, and the one-party dominated Parliament in South Africa, even less so. Kenya, I guess, is the same problem. Joel Barkin knows more about that than I do. But how does one get a check? How does one make the Parliament, especially in a one-party dominated system, some kind of a real check on the power of the presidency? And then Marina's question about the real grassroots input.
Yes. It is about, there are different mechanisms. At the start, one started talking about leadership, and that is also leadership within Parliament, I believe, for people to really be able to assert themselves. Of course, given, Paul's talked about our electoral system, given the fact that it's a list system, proportional representation list system, it does, we've seen, make accountability very, very difficult. Often that relationship between Parliament and the executive. Interestingly enough, just in the past week, there have been some quite serious changes, but some changes within Parliament, a sort of reshuffling of the ANC within Parliament, within the caucus, different people taking up positions as whips and as chairpersons of the party, and in an attempt by the party to actually create greater levels of oversight and greater levels of accountability. And one can talk about those individual appointments and ask whether they're, whether they are good or bad. The question is, and we don't have the answer to this, which is whether those shifts are opportunistic because of the time, and whether they're principled. And I think that the test will be in terms of time, in terms of these 18 months. How do these individuals interact with the executive? How do they really robustly hold government to account, whether it's on electricity, on housing, healthcare, and all the range of issues, foreign policy, but also how you, whether in a new presidency, whether that same robustness will actually continue. And we were chatting to some people, and the point is one doesn't really know. And the issue, I think, also for those of us who watch Parliament, those of us who follow its trajectory, and I agree that the South African Parliament hasn't shown itself to be very robust in holding Parliament to account. I mean, we have several instances of failed oversight, and the question is what sort of individuals the party as well is placing in certain positions. And it becomes very complex also because of the list system, but also because individuals cling to those positions as members of Parliament, often because there aren't other choices, and that makes independent mindedness within that environment very difficult. And so we shouldn't kid ourselves that it's a simple thing. And I'm not sure there's any one answer. I think the answer is somewhere in creating systems and processes in terms of getting citizen involvement back into Parliament. How do you create greater links with constituencies so that you have people's concerns? But I think the answer is also somewhere in terms of in a sort of texture of creating within society a culture of accountability, and that we're very new at. We really are only growing into that. And so the test will be, in 2009, what kind of Parliament will we see in 2009, and will there be enough of a sort of effect of these sort of days of accountability, whether that will be enough for Parliament to, is 18 months enough to cement itself so that it does really become an institution which is proud of seeing itself as one which robustly holds the executive to account. It's got a long way to go in that.
You want to deal any more with Marina's question about continued grassroots input after this transition period?
Sorry?
Since that grassroots may continue to...
Oh, yes, yeah. I mean, it is. I mean, it's the point that I've made, I think, around citizens and the way in which those concerns are channeled to Parliament, and also how grassroots supporters are actually going to be speaking out, whether it's in protests around whatever issues they are. If those continue, there is a sense that Parliament can't ignore that. But one would have to see the momentum which that carries, I think, throughout the country, and how that reverberates within Parliament. Do you want to add?
I think you have a question here, and then Pauline, and then we'll go.
You're busy.
Thank you. I'm Jonathan Davidson. I'm a board member of the Council for a Community of Democracies. I'd like to thank you both for very illuminating remarks, which, to my mind, reaffirm the relatively sophisticated and relatively robust nature of South African democracy. And the problems that you describe, such as citizen alienation from government and overly deferential parliaments, corrupt politicians, even imperial presidencies, they're not unknown in all democracies. In fact, they're common, really, to most democracies, including the most advanced, and we've survived them. So my question turns to the title of your panel, which is The Future of Democracy in South Africa, and it raises the unspoken but implicit question that future is in some respects in doubt. So could you elaborate a little bit on that? Should we be concerned about the quality of democracy in the future in South Africa, or should we be more concerned than that?
Pauline, I'm going to take 4 questions here and there. So, Pauline.
Yeah, Pauline Baker with the Fund for Peace. My question concerns South African foreign policy, and there are 3 components to it. One, given the complexity and apparently the longevity of this process of defining new political space, are we to expect that South African leadership in foreign policy, and particularly in Africa, will now diminish as it concerns itself mostly with internal political arrangements, as happened in many societies? Until that is sorted out, they're not really going to be able to exercise much leadership. Secondly, what is the impact of the Kenyan crisis on South African leadership? They now have 2 major crises almost on their doorstep. Kenya's not bordering it, but still the impact on the region. So they've got Zimbabwe, which is coming to a head, and the impact on domestic politics is growing more and more with the raid on the church and so forth recently. And third, what is going to be the attitude of South Africa in the larger international scope, particularly with regard to the U.S. and China, both of which are launching new initiatives in Africa, one economic and the other African, which the South African government's not too crazy about? Thanks.
Thanks. I take this gentleman and then Joel, and then we'll do another round.
Charlton, freelance correspondent. What's the metal production in South Africa in terms of the world metal supply? And second is Paul, you have been in Taiwan. Have you compared the reconciliation process and the election between the Taiwan and South Africa? But in general, have you compared the democratic process between Taiwan and South Africa? Thank you.
Interesting. Joel Barkin, and then we'll get these answers.
Yeah, Joel Barkin, CSIS. On this question of redefining political space and the point that Princeton hinted at, but that you didn't respond to, one-party dominance, has this whole intra-party conflict and Polokwane hastened the eventual breakup of the ANC? Because I would argue that until there is a viable African opposition, not the DA, the possibilities for Parliament and the strengthening of other institutions, and that, for that matter, the accountability theme that you've been stressing, is unlikely.
Thanks, Joel.
Will be delayed.
Well, let's start with the future of democracy question, and you can incorporate that, I think, also Joel's question about one party and opposition and what that means for the long-term institutional strength of democracy in South Africa.
It's sort of $1 million question. I think that I find it personally hard to answer, simply because I think that our future has always, in a way, South Africans live with the degree of uncertainty, and I think that we need to be frank about that. Is that whether we were during the apartheid years, post-apartheid, and so on, during the transition, we lived with that degree of uncertainty. I think that we have a very good foundation on which to build. I think that it's a very critical time, and the decisions that we make now are certainly going to impact heavily on the kind of future that we have. And so it's important that I see us as being at a moment of really, when I talk about redefining political space, at a moment of a very deep choice. What kind of society do we want to have? And that choice is dependent both on leadership, but also on citizens, and holding government to account, and also on organizations like ourselves to also start defining that public discourse. So I see us as at a very real crossroads. I'm not sort of overly pessimistic about that. I don't think we must be overwhelmed by it, but it's a time of great challenge. And Joel, your question about the one-party dominance, I think, it's the perennial question. Every year we get asked, will the ANC split, will the Allies split, is this alliance going to split? I don't think in the near future we will see that, because I think that it's for COSATU and the SACP, I think at the moment they have fashioned a political space, and that space is one that they will continue to use robustly within the alliance. Certainly under President Mbeki, there were concerns about their ability to influence and so on, but also the fact that there is a space for them to be listened to within the broader ANC, that it's better often to be inside than outside. So I certainly don't predict that. But the kind of opposition, so do we look to the smaller opposition parties? I agree. I don't think that's where it is. But at the same time, I don't think we must lose what is at the heart of our constitution, which is multi-partyism, and that there's a place for the little people, and so on, the Freedom Front Plus and smaller parties. But those countervailing forces of power are both within the ANC and outside.
Paul, you want to comment on this?
Yes.
I can't imagine Tony Leon wanting to be referred to as one of the little people.
Yes, and even less his successor, Helen Ziller.
Correct.
Yes.
The fact is that the opposition parties have not managed, and it looks like will not manage, to expand their electoral support into the African community, and what is more, with the renewal of the ANC, the heat is going to be aimed at the outgoing president and his outgoing cabinet, and one suspects therefore that the ANC will campaign in the next election, sort of like an opposition. We are the new incoming government, and I suspect that will improve their chances. But secondly, because we will retain our proportional system, unless a voter moves his or her vote, the proportion that the ANC can achieve can remain high, even if a large number of people decline to vote. So there is going to be a debate in the foreseeable future about the electoral system. It's back on the table as a policy issue, and we are very glad about that. Just as the question of regulation of party funding is back on the table, and floor crossing, and a whole range of things which were not up for public debate will be back on the table, and it's a window of opportunity to attend to those. But it has been demonstrated that the ANC itself is quite significantly different in different parts of the country, and as with other single party dominant societies, those of us working in them need to pay attention to internal democracy within the dominant parties, and ensuring that there is in fact public debate happening inside those parties while one is considering the material conditions which may change and give more space to other parties. That brings me to the foreign policy issues. Clearly, the Mbeki presidency, you had the presidency and the Department of Foreign Affairs both playing extremely active roles and aspirational roles internationally. When Mr. Zuma was in fact deputy president, he himself was quite heavily involved, for example, in Burundi. And in fact, interestingly enough, while he was deputy president, he introduced a public forum with civil society groups and interest groups inside South Africa who were invited into the discussion about his own international role. And the new international director in the ANC, Ibrahim, has been playing a quite active role in some of the peace processes in a variety of places around the world. So I suspect there will be an attempt to if not retain the sort of leadership, at least continue to contribute to international relations. But energy, as you say, can be sucked into other problems. I don't think one's going to see too much change in our relations with the US and China. As you say, AFRICON is not popular, and I think that I don't think that's just the view of the Minister of Defense, whose political career is over, and therefore it's likely that it will continue. But when you're if someone asks you to dance and you're a small player, you dance with them. And at the moment, I think we're trying to dance with everybody. So at the moment, the attention to the Zimbabwe crisis seems to be making it quite difficult. That plus our summer holidays seem to be making it quite difficult for us to attend to the Kenyan crisis, and I think there's some relief that others are attending to it. But it is a real concern, and the apparent inability of the African Union to really make a significant impact on that crisis is something to worry about, I think. We can't just rely on elder statesmen who, indefinitely. We need to institutionalize these things. I'm just personally not sure. Just a very quick one on, if I can duck the raw materials thing, if you don't mind. The reconciliation process in South Africa attempted to confront the abuse of power, both by the government in power and indeed by the ANC in exile and other political parties. And it was as much about truth as reconciliation. The one followed the other. It takes great bravery to confront the truth and to stop it from becoming an election issue and to go on becoming a tool in the hands of one or other party. Now, to be honest, we haven't confronted all the issues around race, and so there are still times when race becomes a tool in the hands of one or other interest group in South Africa. I would hope that folk in Taiwan confront the past in ways which take it out of the political arena and make it not available to one or other party in future election processes. It'll be interesting to see how things work out in the next little while. As for our democratic trajectory, South Africans really are keen to explore how democracies establish themselves and develop and confront the changes facing our world, which are quite serious, and we have to have a lot of humility about that. And to the extent that we can be helpful in explaining our story, will, I hope, make a difference to other countries, and the extent to which other countries, like Taiwan, can explain their story, I hope will also make a difference to other countries. But in some ways we are quite different. We have different neighbors, at the very least.
I think we have time for about two more. Any others? Someone way in the back.
I'm Ray Copson. I edit the CSIS Online Africa Policy Forum, where we're always looking for the well-argued essay. Pauline mentioned the subject of China, and I wanted to get back to that. Here in Washington, we're watching China's rise in Africa with considerable awe and amazement, but we don't hear so much about China in South Africa. and I wonder if the speakers have any observations on how China might be involved, what the economic and political consequences of that might be.
Right here. Microphone? Ah.
Very much. Yeah, just quickly. My name is Saad Noor. I do keep an eye on the affairs of a small democracy called Somaliland in the Horn of Africa. What I would like to ask is a simple question. There are those in the continent who do believe at this point, or at least repeatedly say, that the tension between the current leadership of the ANC and Mr. Zuma, of course he is in the ANC too, at least between the two men, it's just that President Mbeki and his group really do not want to see a president who is a Zulu president. What do you say about that, please?
I think that I'll take one more, quick, and then we're going to have to finish up in 5 minutes.
I'm Valerie in Jerusalem. I work for the Institute for Multi-Track Diplomacy and Global Water. My question is for Graham. Yes, peace building, peace resolution is good, but conflict prevention is better. You talked about that the electricity crisis it overshadows many other problems, and you talked also about the immigration that is increasing and increasing. Of course, if you have more population, we're going to have problems with the electricity, we're going to have problems with water, so we have problems with natural resources. Well, we know the new initiative of Africa Command, AFRICOM, and you said also that you're ready to dance with everybody. Are you ready to dance with AU, or are you ready to dance with the Pentagon? Are you willing to welcome AFRICOM in case you can't resolve the problem yourselves?
Okay, thanks. We got just a very few minutes, so if you can take
very quick. Look, China really needs a bigger discussion, but you should understand that the Chinese embassy in South Africa is being expanded at the moment. I think when it's finished, it will certainly be larger than the U.S. embassy, and it will be 2 blocks away from the U.S. embassy. There's very strong links between the two countries, and they seem to be growing, but we don't have the same financial dependencies, at least to date, that other countries in Africa have. But there are constraints to growth which China seems willing to help out with, as you know. It's true Mr. Zuma is comes from Zulu. It's true, that's true. But he represents a whole range of other characteristics which are as important to him and his followers, and as inimical to some of the people who stood against him. He's a traditionalist. He's a populist in some ways. He's a gregarious man who very inclusive, and he doesn't parade himself as a global sophisticate. Now, all those things were welcomed by some people and really seen as a problem by others. Leave aside the question of this corruption case, which will start to be resolved from August onwards. So ethnic identity can very quickly be mobilized, but at the moment it's not the fundamental factor in our country. And all I can say about AFRICON is that the Minister of Defense, who spoke on behalf of government, and as in my conversation with him, seemed to feel that he had the confidence of other members of the African Union, was that when it came to military presence on Africa, we really didn't want it. And that is a different discussion from discussions around development aid, and indeed even a different discussion from discussions around conflict prevention. And so on. So that's unfortunately a very short answer to a very much more complicated debate.
Judith, you have a final word?
No, I think that's pretty just about covered it.
Okay.
I think I've said enough.
I want to thank our panelists.